Uh, hey, everybody. I was getting ready to go live on here, and I realized I had a broom in the background, which was not aesthetically pleasing. It has been polleny uh, in Georgia. It has been intense around here. I have actually not seen it in 10 years of living in Georgia. I've not seen it like this before. Um, Absolutely intense, and it just came completely out of nowhere. I was looking at the last Bourbon talk a couple of weeks ago. By the way, I missed you all last week. It's nice to be back. I was looking at it, and like I was all bundled up in like a jacket and a scarf. It hit 83, 84 today, and just the pollen swept in. And I just looked out today. I was doing some work, and I looked out today, and in the past, it was like you could see the pollen sort of dancing on the wind. You know, you can sort of see it come off the trees a little bit. But today, the world was yellow. It was really, really intense. And then it was just like there's not a surface in my life right now that isn't coated in pollen. Like this table that I'm at, my phone today constantly. I was sitting out here doing some work on the new book, and it was like in between tapping keys, it would just be coated in pollen. And meanwhile, I'm from the Midwest. Like I have a little bit of tolerance built up for certain things, but Southern pine pollen is not what I'm used to. Oh, I can't use a neti pot. The idea of a neti pot makes me itchy. Ugh. Ugh. I get it. I've been told that it's pretty good. The new book's going really well, actually. I started on. Cheers, by the way. Good to see everybody. I started on chapter 3 of the new book, and I'm currently in what some historians have called like the age of exploration, or the age of like the Reformation and the conquest of the so-called New World. What I'm finding is madness. I wasn't prepared for everything that I found. Sort of like the basis of capitalism, the rise of corporations, all of that stuff. The rise of modern capitalism and the rise of corporations are all based on slave trade. And that was something that I sort of understood, that slavery and the African slave trade was obviously important for the rise of capitalism, but it was the rise of international corporations and stockholding companies, all based on exploiting African and indigenous labor. It's awful, absolutely awful. So I've been diving into that and sort of looking at the split at this moment, and what you basically see at this point. And I talked about it on a past Bourbon talk, this idea of circles within circles and how reality can change and shift and all that. There's a little bit of that pollen right there. And what I'm starting to see in this time period from like the 15th century up to the beginning of the 18th century. Yeah, no. So the British East India Company was one of the first competitive mega corporations, but the Dutch East India Company was like the first. And these corporations, and by the way, like what I'm talking about here, I want to point out, while I'm doing this book, it's all with an eye to the current moment. And what we're kind of watching, and we're going to talk a little bit about it tonight, is we're watching the dismantling of nation states and individuals and liberal democracy. And what we're watching in a lot of ways is the rise of transnational corporations that are actually growing larger than the countries that birthed them. And one of the side effects of that, and what we saw from that time period that I'm talking about right now, I mean, they had their own armies and navies. I mean, they were just like gallivanting around the world, and they had been given sort of the powers of state, police powers, the power to make war, the power to make treaties. They had armies, navies, and they would just go into places around the world and they would just take them over, or they would brutalize people. One of the nastiest things that I have found with the Dutch East India Company is they wanted to corner the nutmeg market, which it's funny to think about the power of spices and all that, but they just went into these islands and just massacred everybody. And then they would go in, and you actually reach this point where, like, the Dutch East India Company and the East India Company, they started fighting wars with each other. I mean, they would just have like naval battles and land battles with each other the same way that nations would. And the problem, and this is one of the places where we're at, is we don't think about the possibility that like the reality that we know could change so drastically. Like, we just kind of think that we almost kind of think that like what we've got will just go into perpetuity and there won't be these big major changes, the circle within the circle that I keep talking about. And one of the things that can happen here, and one of the possibilities, and there are only right now a few possibilities of where this shitstorm is going. One of the possibilities is that we reach the point where corporations eclipse nation states and they become larger than nation states. And then all of a sudden, they don't have to answer to political bodies. They don't have to answer to democracy and the will of the people. That's a possibility. That is one of the situations that we have taking place. And you actually see a lot of the people who put into place the globalist sort of machine that we're dealing with now, who, you know, they're still talking again about nationalism and patriotism and all this stuff, when effectively countries have sort of been thrown out a little bit. So anyway, it's really odd and disconcerting to read about how the corporations at that point were ruling things and running things, and to think about the possibility that they could take over. And one of the things, and by the way, I already have a couple of questions about CPAC. And I'm glad that we're going to talk about CPAC tonight, because the Republican Party, and if you haven't read it already, I wrote an article on my Substack, which, by the way, thank you everybody for encouraging me to get a Substack. I am thrilled with that platform. I am so happy. And I've actually got asked a question about social media and opening up that new account. And I want to talk about it because I'm pumped. I am happy as hell. I'm in a good mood because I'm hanging out with you fine people. Cheers. I like this bi-weekly format. It gives me the opportunity to miss people and come back and be excited. But I wrote an article on Substack today about how the Republican Party doesn't really exist anymore. One of the things that is happening is the Republican Party has no ideology whatsoever. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. But they have become the mechanism by which the wealthy and the powerful control American politics, or dismantle American politics, more or less. They function as what we think is a political party, but it's not. It's just basically a PR firm that brings in the anger of populism and the things that people are actually pissed off about and actually have a reason to be pissed off about, and then launders it, takes it through a lens of bullshit aggrievement, and then redirects it. And that's what the Republican Party has become. And one of the things that the wealthy and the powerful corporations and international economic influences want is they want to figure out a way to dismantle what we want. They don't want us to be able to choose politicians, especially politicians who could possibly change things. What they want to do, and this is sort of it's a new iteration of politics, what some people would call illiberal democracy or controlled democracy. They want to create a situation where me and you, who grew up thinking that you could vote for president, it would change the world, or that politics could possibly change things, what they want is a situation where our politics can't do anything. We still think that we're voting for change and big movements and stuff like that. But what we're actually doing is we're just sort of participating in a sham system. And eventually over time, and Russia, by the way, I'm so glad that you said that, Timothy, because that's exactly what's going on in Russia. They have elections, they supposedly have these freedoms, but they're not real. Oh, we're going to talk about minimum wage. Yeah, don't worry about that, Panther. We're going to talk about minimum wage. But yeah, eventually what ends up happening is in these managed democracies, what ends up happening is people start feeling like they don't have power and that they're alone and alienated. And yeah, they have rights, but they don't want to use them because there's consequence to it. You could be rounded up. Your family could be imprisoned. You could face severe economic and violent repercussions. It's a pseudo-democracy. Yeah. And that's actually what a lot of people are looking for. And one of the things that we're finding is that the Republican Party, because they can't win elections anymore, they're absolutely incredibly unpopular. They're dismantling the organs of democracy. It definitely does already feel that way. It feels all jammed up and it feels like a lack of power, but it's not true. That system has not come into fruition yet. It's working. It's really, really coming into its own, and we can feel it. It's one of the reasons why we're so frustrated and pissed off right now. But yeah, it is. It's really, really hard. It's really, really hard. But if we can recognize it, we can work against it. But anyway, that's what I've been working on. I am 20 some pages into the 3rd chapter. I'm really loving this project, although it's the hardest thing I've ever done. Easily the hardest thing that I've ever done. We're going to talk a little bit. So the last time we did this, I did sort of an abbreviated cut down bourbon talk where I didn't really take questions. I was talking about my frustration with the political system and social media. I'm going to address that in a little bit, but we'll get to that in a minute. Thank you for the patience and the support. Everyone was so kind. Everyone was just reaching out and asking if I was okay and telling me that, they appreciate me. And it meant a lot to me. Y'all are really cool and really, really kind, good people, and I appreciate it. All right, let's get to questions. Busy D says, what are your takeaways from CPAC? It felt not great. It was not great. I paid way too much attention to CPAC. And one of the reasons that I paid attention to it was I really wanted to see how they reacted to the post-Trump era. And I was wondering if maybe they were going to honor Trump, try and keep the base close, and then start to move into new waters, which would be smart because Donald Trump is incredibly unpopular with anyone besides like his hardcore base. That's not what happened. That is not at all what happened at CPAC. CPAC was a celebration of Trump and a reaffirmation that they are his party. I mean, it was constant. And what's more, there was no policy at all there. I actually kind of thought that maybe some of the wonks would come back. And by wonks, I'm talking about people who pay attention to policy and legislation and statistics and those types of people, like think tank people. CPAC and the Republican Party used to be run very much by people who would come in and they would have big, giant conversations about like getting rid of taxes and minimum wage and how to move credits and deregulation. That's not what it was. And it hasn't been for a while. I thought there was a possibility that those people, the quote unquote intellectuals of the Republican Party, would try and reassert some sort of control at CPAC. And I actually thought, and maybe this is the naive part of me, I actually thought that some of the Republicans would have sort of been like, okay, listen, this Trump thing, we got our justices and deregulation and we got our economic policies passed. That is not what happened. This was full-on Trump worship and a constant drumbeat of perceived persecution. It was one person after another telling really terrible non-jokes, and it would just be like, how about that new Green Deal, huh? Or whatever in the hell. And, talking about how their Instagrams had been shadow banned. It has turned into a party that has nothing except for cultural, racial, misogynistic rage. That's the only thing that they have left in their bag. They have no policies. They have no principles. Reality, and this shouldn't shock people, but to watch it happen, reality was twisted and destroyed constantly. I mean, they ran videos. I don't know if anybody saw this. They ran videos of just like right-wing provocateurs, like getting in people's faces and asking them to prove that the coup at the Capitol had anything to do with Donald Trump. That's what they did. It was nothing except for a pep rally and gathering. The samurai thing. Oh my God, we're going to talk about that in a second because there's something building right there. We will talk about it for a while. So what I watched and what I walked away from CPAC was the feeling that the Republican Party is just, it's winding deeper and deeper into itself. It has absolutely no desire whatsoever to grow its base. It has no desire to reach out to anyone else. The one thing that they kept talking about, well, besides socialism, which, by the way, I think it should tell you something that this is the number one thing that they actually go after and are serious about. But the one thing that they just continually brought up was figuring out ways to disenfranchise people, because that's the only thing that they have. That's it. The Republican Party has the ability to gum up the works and deny people the right to vote. They can't win elections. They can't do anything. Oh, and the cancel culture, exactly. Because they have come up with this idea that cancel culture, which is the same thing that they used to say about like affirmative action, the idea that liberals control everything and they're going to basically, you know, ruin your life and your kids' lives. They've got nothing. Absolutely nothing. And then there was a thing. Okay, so Trump was over an hour late to his speech. And what was amazing was a guy came out and he was like, hey, just wanted to let everybody know this is going exactly as scheduled. Don't worry. I know that we're an hour beyond schedule, but that's absolutely the way it's supposed to go. And then they played a half-hour commercial for CPAC, and I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But what ended up happening was they started showing these commercials where it was like, at one point there was like a Japanese conservative who's like, you all are samurais, I'm a samurai, we are going to be samurais together. And the big push that CPAC was making at this conference was that they are building an international coalition. Which the second question that I have from Salmon is, please sum up AFPAC also, which, by the way, right-wing extremist, white nationalist, white supremacist. You've heard me talk about this in the past. Nick and I went over this on the Muckrake podcast back during the Black Lives Matter movement, where we were talking about how the right wing in America was starting to have conversations with the right-wing white supremacist in Russia. They were sharing information, they were sharing training, they were sharing philosophy. This was happening as Steve Bannon was meeting with people like Alexander Dugin in Europe, and they were starting to come together a little bit to discuss how to erase liberal democracy, which they see as like one of the great mistakes in human history. I do not think it is a coincidence that the American Republican Party, which, by the way, is not conservative, and I really, really hate even having to use the word conservative because they don't actually have an ideology besides the pursuit of power and profit. It's not a coincidence that all of these international ties are being built. What is happening right now is that, and it's not, again, I want to be careful with this. It's not conservatives. It's wealthy white people who are starting to see, and I talk all the time about this, which is that fascism is a response to when capitalism starts to fail, societal cohesion starts to fail because people are becoming radicalized and frustrated and alienated. And as people start pushing back and become more and more interested in reform movements or, leftist ideas, all of a sudden the fascists show up and they're either going to take away your vote or they're going to make your blood run in the streets. That's not a coincidence right now that all of this is happening as capitalism is starting to fail on an international scale. That globalism that I talked about, that system that is created like a wealthy elite who are talking about moving to Mars and never dying. It's not a coincidence that as people are starting to question that stuff, and as leftist reformist ideas start to actually take hold, that fascism is now starting to really consolidate around the world. Now, this is a big giant thing. I hope you don't mind. Sometimes I enjoy going on a big giant thing on one of these things, but it's true. If you think about these big moments, these big epochs, right? There are these moments where all of a sudden movements coalesce, or there's a crisis of the economy, or a political crisis, or both. They usually come together. What ends up happening is when those situations arrive, you have the rise of things like fascism or proto-fascism, or in this case, it'd be neo-fascism, or whatever we end up calling what this thing is. You have those types of movements. You also end up with situations where countries start picking sides with each other and you start having international conflicts. This isn't just World War II, World War I. I mean, right now I'm studying a little bit the 30 Years' War. You actually notice that this is just kind of what these systems do. They always end up picking sides with one another, and particularly when it comes to economic situations or with capitalism, when all of a sudden there's no more growth that can possibly happen, you start having to have fights about who owns what territory and who's going to be exploited and screwed over. These people are trying really, really hard to form an international movement. It reminds me a lot when Charles Lindbergh was, a viable candidate for president of the United States of America. He was saying over and over and over again, we need to join with Hitler in a league of white nations. And if we are going to, I believe he said, stem the rising tide of color, which, by the way, he was using the words of massively popular American intellectuals at the time. One of the things that you end up finding is this idea that maybe around that time, America was starting to teeter in the direction of possibly joining with the fascists. Fascism was very popular prior to Pearl Harbor. We have a situation where we have a lot of people who would not think twice about joining in a league of white supremacy. I mean, that's what they're trying to do. That's what the Republicans are putting a smiling face on right now. So what we're actually watching at this point is an international fascistic, white supremacist, capitalistic, exploitive movement. It's a lot. I mean, I'm not telling you that that's where this thing is going, but I'm telling you that that is a possibility. We might look up sometime in the next few years, and if we have some sort of a crisis, whether or not it's a climate crisis or an economic crisis, if all of a sudden things get bad, that's what happens. When countries get desperate, they start going down really bad paths. Fascism starts taking off. They start invading other countries. I mean, it could be bad. This is why we have to do better. We have to do better. And the third question, and D West asked that when I came in here, which is, am I going to discuss the Golden Trump? That idol that they made of Donald Trump is a perfect encapsulation of what we're dealing with here. Trump's not anything that they think that he is. He's not conservative. He doesn't really, he doesn't understand these things. He gets up and he just speaks absolute total nonsense. He doesn't help anybody besides himself and the people that, that he cares about and that will make him money. The fact that they have laundered him and transformed him into a sacrilegious idol. And if you look at the statue, I posted the picture on the Substack article I wrote, because if you actually look at the picture, I was DMing with somebody about this earlier. Go and look at that picture. It's an amalgam of multiple things. Actually, I'm gonna go ahead and pull this up because this shit's nuts. And if you look at the Trump statue, on top he's wearing a suit, but down at the bottom he's wearing these swim trunks, right? And flip-flops. Trump would never wear that. It's a mishmash of things. Then on top of it, in one hand he's holding a magic wand, and in the other he's holding the Constitution. This makes no coherent sense. It's all things to all people. It's Trump as a business person, but also he's just cool and casual, right? He's just a relatable kind of guy. Then on the other hand, he has power with the magic wand. He can just make things happen. And on the other hand, he's protecting the Constitution, which is a tangible terrestrial law. What the hell? It's incoherent. And the point here is that golden statue, which is sacrilegious, is, honest to God, the perfect encapsulation of what's happening in the Republican Party. They are living in a world where they have to bring together all of these inconsistencies and incoherent ideas, and they have to make them work at the same time. And one of the reasons that they're so angry all the time is because they have to consistently run it through their head and be like, yes, that's what I like. No, this is what I want. This right here. This is what I want. Absolutely, this is what I want. Ha ha ha. This is what I want. And that's one of the reasons why they are just so aggressive in it, because they're not going to talk about their ideology because they don't have it. They don't actually have a coherent idea. They are constantly running one step ahead of the chaos of cognitive dissonance. And we keep talking about this. The Republican Party is a psychosexual disaster of repression and messed up people. It's a mess. It's an absolute mess. But they're not supposed to be coherent because they're not a real party. They're a front. They are just there to destroy government as a public good, erode trust in government or faith in government, or erode any hope of something better. Meanwhile, and I wrote about this, it's like with Rush Limbaugh, you're supposed to make fun of and deride people and attack people if they have an idea for how things might be better. Well, meanwhile, you make sure that your life is pretty shitty too, because that's better than your enemy having things better. It's an incoherent project, but it's not supposed to be coherent. It's supposed to be so many different things to so many different people. The Republican Party has always, in modern history, been a front for white, patriarchal, capitalistic power. But now, in order to even get close to the amount of votes that they need to win in an electoral college and or hold on to even a little bit of power, these white supremacist levers of power, they've had to appeal to working class white people and middle class white people and continually embrace white patriarchal supremacy. It's not a coherent project. It has nothing to do with getting things done. It's about not getting things done. They've transformed politics into attacking your enemies, but not having a cohesive intellectual idea, which unfortunately we got to talk about a little bit more. Bog Toggle says, what do you think might have been Trump's ultimate aim by trashing at CPAC today the members of his party who did not object to certify Biden? What you watched today was a power grab by Trump. And by the way, I think it's really important that we point out that everything about CPAC was run by Trump's people. Right before Trump came out, Trump's own personal pollster came out to tell everyone that Donald Trump handedly won the CPAC straw poll. Everybody who got asked about his policies and presidency, he had like 97% approval, which is just madness, by the way. And then, even if you talked about what would happen if he didn't run in 2024, CPAC was all about how the road to the presidency in the Republican Party has to run through Donald Trump. It was a power grab today. Trump didn't even care. He just came out and gave a low energy ass speech, and it was just the old Trump thing. He couldn't even be bothered to actually get up for this thing. It was so sad. But CPAC was it was Trump all day, every day. That's all it was. And they have nothing else they can do. DeSantis was second. DeSantis sacrificed the state of Florida to COVID. and he came in second in the straw poll. DeSantis will never get a nomination for president, by the way. I'll go ahead and put down a marker on that right there. I just do not see that happening. By the way, in the poll where Trump wasn't running for president in 2024, Trump Jr. was like in the top 5 or top 10. The Republican Party was engaging in dynastic politics today. Just saying. Just saying. Alexis, why do you think the regular GOP politicians and community aren't speaking out against CPAC? They've learned that if you pick every battle, number one, you're going to receive death threats left and right. Second of all, it makes sure that, they're not going to alienate their voters. I mean, even somebody like a Mitt Romney, and listen, I understand that Mitt Romney voted the right way in terms of impeachment and all that stuff, and I understand that he's more reasonable than Republicans, but he's not great. Like, he's not your friend, he's not your ally. Mitt Romney has sold his soul multiple times to the Republican Party and Donald Trump, and they're not going to bite the hand that feeds them. I mean, Sass is like one of the few who will go on the record about this stuff, but yeah, they're along for the ride. I mean, Liz Cheney is not your friend. Just isn't. So I'm glad you asked about the Nazi symbol. I don't know. Like there are times where symbols show up and all of a sudden they, it seems like maybe it was planned, maybe it wasn't. I know we talked about this on the Muckrake podcast the other day. Like, we look for symbolism, we look for patterns. But that being said, that is a very specific symbol, and that is I will just say that if I had to put money on it, I would probably wager that somebody at CPAC is involved in alt-right ideas, probably Bannonism. He's really big into symbols and symbology and the esoteric bullshit. Somebody like that probably played a role in it and probably made it happen. But, I think a lot of people out there got a message. A lot of people got a message. Dr. B Game Cartoon suspect that we were the target audience for Trump's speech. Sort of. I think in a lot of ways that I think a lot of CPAC was spent trying to trigger libs because that's the one joy that these joyless people get out of it. Yeah, they love this idea that that they're upsetting people somewhere. I mean, they're just the most abusive assholes. And what came across what came across at CPAC was just an absolute pathetic group of people. A really, really, really sad group of people. It's incredible how unhealthy these people are. Sam, your Substack article on the question of what America actually is got me thinking. I've got my thoughts, but if you had to define it, what is America? So, by the way, Substack's been great. I've really, really enjoyed it. It's been really nice to be able to get my thoughts out there and write more than what Twitter has allowed me to write. We will talk about social media in a minute and the problems and my thoughts on it. But it's been really, really nice. And people have been kind about it. So thank you for the question, Sam. I wrote in this article about, how we can't even build our old military industrial complex projects anymore. We can't take care of our own people during disasters. On top of that, the punting of the Khashoggi situation was really gross. I was very, very upset when it came out of the Biden administration that the price was too high to really deal with the people who killed Khashoggi. That's incredible that would happen. And what we have seen with America, and I think it's something that we have all felt, been suspicious of, or sort of seen, is that America is faltering. America, is not this exceptional country that it used to be. We're collapsing under the weight of empire and under all of the ethical and moral lines that we've crossed, and our espoused principles have just been exposed as not being real. The sad truth at this point is that America at this moment is one of the best weapons, salespeople in the world. No, I don't think America was ever exceptional. No, I think America is like a nation like any others. It just so happens that we were born out of a revolution that was able to be sold to people as being some sort of ordained by God situation. Yeah, we're great arms dealers, although we're not doing great with that lately. We came and build new weapons, and on top of that, we'll sell any country on a list. It doesn't matter who they use them against and how they hurt people. We also, as I was talking about in this article, we have created an economic system that has made us the perfect clearinghouse for money to come in and go out. We're a really good middleman for money. We're a really, really good front for money to be laundered in and out and redistributed from the bottom up. The old story of American exceptionalism, that lie and fraud, it convinced a lot of people, and it sold a lot of weapons, and it made a lot of money, and it hid a lot of wrongdoing. So America right now, after we've started to collapse in the wake of forever wars, we're a middling arms manufacturer, an arms dealer, and a wonderful middleman for the flow of money and capital from the bottom to the top. Yeah, I've been paying attention to the GameStop thing. I think in part it shows how the markets are not just manipulatable, but we talked about this on Muckrake. It's this situation where there's a club for money, and most of us aren't in it. And the moment that we get in it, it's just like, oh my God, I can't believe these people are getting money. It's a big, giant, massive problem. Hecatron. It's a good name. I like that, Hecatron. To jump off a convo on Discord, which, by the way, if you're not, the Muckrake Podcast, if you become a patron, patreon.com/Muckrake Podcast, we have a Discord. I really have been enjoying the Discord lately. Really good people, really supportive, really knowledgeable, really, really smart, but also kind. If you want to get on that, all you have to do is become a patron. It is well worth it. To jump off the convo on Discord, is there any real benefit to following the stream of live news here on Twitter versus limiting consumption to curated news? No, I don't think so. I have a theory on Twitter, and I've got a follow-up question about what I've been thinking about since we did the Bourbon talk last. First and foremost, I think Twitter was not intended to be this, but I think it has become sort of the ongoing, rolling, real-time collective unconscious. I think that we're seeing what a lot of people think from moment to moment, and it's so overwhelming and it's so exhausting that it can occasionally give us information, and it can occasionally make us feel like we're feeling what other people are feeling in a moment, but it is not a really great place necessarily to get your news and or get an idea of reality or have conversations or do other things. So yeah, what I have done with Twitter over the past couple of weeks is I have been spending a lot of time rethinking Twitter, how I use it, how I approach it, how I consider it. And Cindy said you walked away from Twitter for a few days, and I heard you talk about the problems with social media and how you were thinking of possible alternatives. Have I had any thoughts? So here is what I talked about a couple of weeks ago, which is Twitter is a commodified reality. It's a place where we go, and our feelings are turned into products. Our outrage or our frustration or our anger is sort of like we're yelling in a jar, and that jar is making other people money, and it makes us feel like all that yelling in the jar is actually like changing the world in a way that like hands-on action or communal action or solidarity might actually change the world. I've also talked about this on the last Bourbon talk. I felt like Twitter's gotten really gross. First and foremost, I've watched I've watched a lot of people, journalists, media types, pundits, who have sort of branded themselves, and it grosses me out in a really, really bad way. And on top of that, while they're doing their act on Twitter, they're also trying to like gain cred based in their little small claustrophobic world. And so like if I'm going to talk about that in a second, Cheryl. Twitter is the only reason why anybody is here tonight. I would not have gotten any sort of a platform or a soapbox if I hadn't have reported on Twitter from Trump rallies or got my writing out there and books out there through Twitter. I think what we need is we need to rethink how we approach it. So what I have now done with Twitter, and like I said 2 weeks ago, Twitter restricts your ability to talk about yourself or talk about your ideas and to actually get your ideas out in full and have conversations. The artificial restriction of how many characters you have means that you can't say everything that needs to be said. It leads to misunderstandings, and it also provokes bad faith readings of what you've done, and also incentivizes people who are trying to sell themselves based on their opinions or the things that they think. I have been trying to use Twitter opposite of what Twitter is. I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to be in Twitter working on brands. I don't want to be on Twitter like engaging in, and I keep talking about like this dunk fest thing where it's like, oh, we got to make fun of people who care or who don't necessarily fit in. It turns into like this weird junior high, elementary school abusive bullying environment. And it's so gross. And it also takes things that are very, very serious, human suffering and societal problems. And what it does is it has created a really bad situation where we can't necessarily pay attention to what's going on, and we can't necessarily grasp how serious things are. So what I have realized is I'm still going to use Twitter to communicate. I'm trying really, really hard in doing this and being on Twitter and writing. I'm trying to be an educator because I didn't know any of this shit when I got my Twitter platform or as I was covering politics. I understood politics as they're usually covered. I didn't understand the deeper actual tissue, the reality within the reality that most people who are involved in Twitter or come from money or learned backgrounds that they have. I had to educate myself, and now I'm trying to pass on information. I'm trying to seed understanding so I can try and seed change. So I'm still trying to do that with Twitter, but I've actually moved a lot of my writing and my research and my energy over to that Substack. And I moved it over to Substack because I have editorial control over that. Whenever I work with like a bigger publication that is going to publish my stuff, you have no idea how much they control what you say and how you say it. It's really weird. And they kind of push you closer into the status quo. They sort of, kind of put the bumpers on the bowling alley for you where it's like, oh, I understand where you're coming from. And a lot of us believe that, but you can't necessarily say it. A lot of people were telling me a while back, don't talk about don't talk about fascism, don't talk about white supremacy, don't talk about conspiracy theories, just kind of drive down this lane. And I was like, no, these are important things. Like, these are important issues that people aren't talking about because they're being constrained by either editorial oversight or they don't want to seem uncool or hysterical or overreacting. Turns out all that shit was true. It just so happens that the media environment, which is where people make a lot of money and they do a lot of those things. Oh, we do not talk about the pandemic anymore. I completely agree. 2,000 plus are still dying a day and we're pretending like this thing's totally fine. Anyway, so I have moved over to Substack where I can express myself in full. And the Substack people have been really kind. They reached out to me after I opened it, and they were like, hey, we think this is going to be good for you, and we want to help you out. They really, truly believe that people should have their voices out there, and there should be alternative voices that are saying things that aren't necessarily being editorialized out of meaning. That's good. So it's been good for me, and I'm still using Twitter. I'm still going to use it to educate and try and seed change, but also trying to do that stuff. No, I don't think that most Republican voters understand that they're fascist. I don't think that. No, I don't think that they do. I think that they think that they are absolute patriots. I think that they live in a reality that is controlled by the Republican Party and status quo people. I really, really do. What gives me hope? I mean, you're hanging out tonight on a Sunday night while I drink bourbon and talk about esoteric politics and deeper conversations. I mean, I usually do this thing for like an hour, hour and a half. I mean, people are interested in this stuff, and they see the flickering of the illusion. I think people are tuned in. I think people are pissed off, and they're getting frustrated. Kelly says, how do we move past the political duopoly that sees all Democrats as good just because they aren't Trump supporters, even as they revert to the very good old days? Speaking of social media, there has been something weird cooking up over the past like week or so. I have been seeing a lot of people so I wrote about how the Biden administration, said that it was the price was too high to go after the people who killed Khashoggi. I think that is an actual criticism. It doesn't make Joe Biden the Antichrist. It doesn't make him Donald Trump. It's disappointing. And the way that they have handled the minimum wage thing has been incredibly disappointing. I'm sorry, but it does not send a good message to the American people as an economic crisis hurts everyone. That, oh, I'm sorry, a parliamentarian had a non-binding judgment, so we just can't do that. Those are missteps. Those are problems. Meanwhile, when I criticize that, and by the way, Joe Biden is president of the United States of America, one of the most powerful human beings on the face of the earth. He can handle criticism. People in power should be criticized. It makes them better, and it can make the world better. Joe Biden can handle it. And if he is at all a politician or a worthy leader, he should be able to handle people calling into question what he does. I'm sorry. Joe Biden is not perfect. The Democratic Party is not perfect. I received a fair amount of not just harassment, but threats from people. I had people emailing me and telling me that I was part of a deep state conspiracy against Joe Biden. I had people reaching out saying that I was probably working with the Russians. Tell me if that sounds familiar. It's the other side of the coin of Trumpism. Now, what has actually happened is that Trump and the GOP have so poisoned discourse and have so created a system of trench warfare within this two-party system that people feel like they can't criticize the party that they support. It has gotten to the point, and I've talked to other journalists too, they've had it too. They've been getting threats from Democratic voters because they called out the Biden administration on minimum wage and the Khashoggi shit. That's a problem. That's an issue. I think the Cuomo thing is another thing in the same way. I'm seeing people online who are like, no, absolutely, this is all made up. There's no reason to question this stuff. I'm sorry, but Democrats are not perfect. Cuomo did not handle the coronavirus very well. Newsom over in California didn't either. If you are going to talk about actual politics and how things happen, you have to be able to criticize the people that you support. Democrats are not perfect. They are not. They are a political party. Sometimes they get it right. Sometimes they get it wrong. It's insane that this is a situation. And I'm sorry. My progressive leftist credentials, whatever we want to call them, are beyond question. I've spent this entire time pushing those ideas. But guess what? If the president in the White House screws up, I'm going to call it out. I told people this for a while. I don't know if the people on the podcast who read my writing believed me. I'm going to call it down the middle. I am not going to kowtow and be a cheerleader for the Biden administration. They're powerful people. They deserve to be questioned. They deserve to be criticized when they screw up. So yeah, it's been weird. It's been weird. Elmnove says, why don't they just mail out $2,000 checks? Why is this all taking so long? That's taking this long is so bizarre. The GOP rammed Amy Barrett in a few weeks. That's the difference in the parties. The Democratic Party does not want to be seen as extremist or radical. I mean, somebody asked about Manchin. I'll bring it up in a second with Manchin, but they don't want to push these things. They don't. They want to go ahead and make sure that like all the I's are dotted and the T's crossed and all that stuff. When it comes to the difference between $1,400 checks and $2,000 checks, well, I mean, you can't have Republicans saying that you're fiscally liberal, can you? They're not reacting to the situation in an actual way. They're handling politics as usual. Ex-NRA says Manchin is a threat to passing legislation, and what's his motive? The problem with Manchin is he's actually a Republican. He just happens to be a Democrat. Like, he's acting according to his principles and to continue getting elected. The sad truth is that to go ahead and pass this relief stuff and to go ahead and get checks out and to actually go ahead and invest in infrastructure and human projects is popular. It's incredibly popular. So if Joe Manchin is worried about re-election, then he needs to go ahead and get on board and actually move this thing left. Quote unquote conservatism and republicanism and Trumpism are not popular. They are incredibly unpopular, which is why they're trying to gerrymander and disenfranchise people. The Democratic Party, if they simply went ahead and passed the things that they said that they cared about and moved further left on the spectrum, would have incredible popularity. But they're frightened of it. Years and years and years of being called socialist and radicals have taken a toll. Ross Hockman says, do you think that right-wing domestic terrorists will try to invade the Capitol or D.C. in general again this year? I don't know. I think one of the things that's really going to be telling in the near future is what happens when the quarantine stops ending. And what happens when all of a sudden we start having open society again. We start having large gatherings. We start having people out and about where, it's not as easily traceable or noticeable. I don't know if they'll attack DC. I don't know if they'll attack the Capitol. If I had to guess right now, I would say that you would probably have state level stuff. You would probably have people in the states or in their cities or whatever. You might have a few asymmetrical incidents of people hurting people. I hope that doesn't happen, but it's a real possibility. The other thing that I'm afraid of is all it takes is one person. It takes one person to load up a Ryder truck with a bunch of explosives. And we have a situation right now where the environment's right for it. I wrote about that. We live in a really radicalizing, alienating culture. I don't know if anything's going to happen on March 4th. I kind of feel like the QAnon community is even kind of divided on that. For people who don't know about it, there was this idea that like America has not really been a nation for a very long time, and that Donald Trump would be sworn in on March 4th and would become, I think it's like the 15th president or something like that. That's pretty far out there, even in QAnon land. But again, it just takes like one person, or they'll make a new date. That's exactly right. Maybe March 20th. But I could see an asymmetrical thing, or I could see a couple of incidents. What I'm also afraid of, and I'll go ahead and say it, and I hope I'm wrong about this, is softer targets. Individuals in Congress. I'm very worried about the health and well-being of people like Ocasio-Cortez and Omar. I'm really worried about that. Exactly, Kim. Kim says the State of the Union is being mentioned now. Exactly. I'm worried about all that. It's awful. Oh, God, the harassment of the Asian population is terrible. Absolutely terrible. I've got students and people that I really care about who have just been so fucking mistreated. It makes me so sick. And I hate that over the past 5 years, since I was covering the Trump campaign and through the Trump presidency, I've had students and friends and loved ones, African Americans, trans people, Asian people, LGBTQ people, just Hispanic people who've just been so mistreated. It breaks my fucking heart to just sort of watch this evil ugliness metastasize. It's so upsetting. It makes me so mad. Awful. Sauce asks, are we going to gear up for nationwide protests and worker strikes? I don't know. I think after the pandemic, history shows us that after pandemics and situations like pandemics, that we kind of see a labor change. The question is what's going to happen. Are people going to be so desperate for jobs because the economy sucks that we're going to turn into a contractor, gig economy where people will be exploited? Or are we going to have people who are able to come together and leverage solidarity? I don't know. I would really love that if post-pandemic we have a new labor grassroots political movement. I mean, that's possible. I'm not going to sit here and say that it couldn't happen, because it could happen. There's always a possibility that this stuff could happen. This is one of the things that I'm always losing my mind about, is people are like, oh, nothing will ever change. There's nothing we could possibly ever do. But the truth is that all things are possible. Like, politics can change in a moment. Narrative can change in a moment. If people come together and find the ability to have solidarity and mutual aid, like, things change. So no, I wouldn't sit here and say that it will necessarily happen, but it could. There could be a big giant change. Janelle Forsyth, do I think the fencing to protect the Capitol Hill area in DC will ever come down? I think eventually, but it's going to be up there for a while. I mean, one of the terrible things is that something like the Capitol coup actually leads to long-term solutions, and I put that in quotes, solutions to issues. I truly and honestly believe that there will probably be some sort of a law enforcement push or an infringement on civil liberties, all to deal with domestic terrorism. The problem is that shit is never just used on the problem it's supposed to be taken care of. It ends up becoming a cudgel or a weapon that is used against political rivals and enemies. So I'm a little afraid of what might end up happening with all of that. Wakandan Pundit says, why are white Democrats in leadership positions so poor and timid on the most powerful force in today's politics race? Great question. I'm going to answer this before we get to the 1 hour mark and I finish up this glass, and then we finish up the questions. It's because in order to actually talk about race and to actually talk about what is going on in this country and where we've come from, you would have to talk about white supremacy. And white supremacy is the basis and the foundation of the modern economic system. A large part of the Democratic leadership are people who believe in market solutions and business solutions and means testing and all that good stuff. They are not interested in big, giant economic and or societal or political changes. They're more interested in making things maybe a little bit better, but they don't want to get into the actual underpinnings of it. This is why our media and powerful people have such a hard time talking about race in this country, because the idea of white supremacy, when you actually start investigating it, when you actually start exploring it, you suddenly realize that white supremacy permeates every part of this country. It is rotten down to its foundation, which is one of the reasons why we need actual massive change. We actually need a reckoning with these past ideas and these past structures. People don't want to talk about that. Now, the Democratic Party is very good at, not saying the things that the Republican Party believes. They also, by the way, don't believe a lot of what the Republican Party believes. But in a lot of it, they are also just either they're terrified of talking about it, and what it could possibly lead to, or because of their political and economic positions, they are in denial about it. But they need to talk about it. They absolutely need to talk about, and they want to keep their white privilege. I keep saying this. You find a person who is so terrified of equality or reform, you find a person who is benefiting from the problem that needs reformed or the equality that needs to be found. We keep seeing that over and over again, whether or not it's, talking about reforming things or we're talking about things like minimum wage. And they're like, what? I'm supposed to pay more for that hamburger? It's like, yeah, you are. Absolutely, you are. Like 10 cents more. Isn't that terrible? All right, here we're 10 out. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Cheers. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad you're here. But that's the problem, is to actually change things. To actually change things, you have to have a consideration of why things need to be changed. And when you start investigating that, what you end up thinking about is your placement in the power structures that need to be changed. It scares the shit out of people. The idea that things could drastically change, or that they might move around, or that their seat at the table might be endangered. And sometimes they start acting counter to that stuff unconsciously. All of a sudden they're like, no, I mean, I've earned what I've got. I mean, that's one of the reasons why media, politicians, and pundits, and journalists, and all these different people, they have a really hard time looking at what's going on. And they live sort of in a denial of it, because they're like, no, I've earned my job. I've earned the money that I have. I've earned, the goods that I have, and all of this stuff that I enjoy, and the comforts and luxuries that I have. Like, to actually start looking at politics and economics and even society in general, and to actually investigate it and look at the truth, is to look in the mirror and investigate yourself. That's one of the reasons this whole thing is so hard. The political is personal, and the personal is political. It's rough. It's a really, really rough thing. And it's one of the most complicated things that we can do. And there's a lot of people who aren't interested in doing the hard work. K-Man, do you think the Senate Democrats will ever end the filibuster? I don't know. It feels like eventually that they're going to have to end the filibuster. I think that they are waiting and waiting and waiting until they find a project that they think it's absolutely, I think eventually that they're going to pull the trigger on that. I think that they understand that the filibuster is what it is. I think they want to build up some political capital and political faith, so they're not called radicals, or they're not called socialist, or, whatever it is. But yeah, I think eventually they'll have to. If the Democrats don't eventually move beyond the filibuster, we're in for some times. Odds of a fist fight in Congress in the next 4 years. Okay, that's a great question. So here's what I'm going to go ahead and say. Okay, odds there's a fist fight, an actual punch thrown in Congress. I'm going to put that at like 15%. A punch being thrown in Congress, I'm putting it 15%. Most of the people in Congress, I don't think, are going to want to throw a punch, right? And if they did, it might be like a real kind of like shitty punch, like just sort of like a cat bobbing at a toy. What I would say is the idea that two members of Congress have to be separated, like they start getting in each other's space. 40%? Because what we're actually watching about, and I hope that the person who asked that has heard me talk about this. This moment right now really resembles the time before the Civil War. And in that time period, you had a lot of these people that they were showing off for their media. They were protecting slavery, and they sort of started having these brawls. And then the next thing that happened was they started bringing in weapons and knives, and then they started having duels. We're already a little bit down the road in terms of symbolism. Lauren Boebert carrying a gun into Congress, and all these Republicans sidestepping the metal detectors. That's the same path. So I would not be shocked if sometime in the next 2 years, we have some sort of a pull apart situation. That's what I would say, because you have a lot of people right now who are basing their entire political futures, ambitions, and all of that on the idea that they're gonna fight, right? They're really, really gonna fight. You know, they're gonna fight for you, and they're not gonna let these radical socialists do it. Diane Russell says, "What are the odds that a congressperson shoots another congressperson?" Next 4 years, zero. But beyond that, I mean, we're going down a weird, bad road. We really, really are. And the worse that this thing gets, if we don't take some sort of a turn, if we don't actually start dealing with stuff, it's going to get really bad. Life's war. If people fear what they don't understand, but they also won't believe the information provided, quote unquote, fake news, how are we supposed to fight the fear mongering? Everything is propaganda. You'd say we have to treat the economic conditions, and I agree, but I can't help anyone with that. I think you can help with the personal stuff. Like, obviously, you can't go to Congress and pass the things that will treat the economic material conditions underneath radicalization. But I think if we are safe, if we feel safe, or we feel the ability, I think we can reach out and start to cure alienation. I think individually we all need to play a role in that, and sort of like healing society, not even necessarily politically, but personally and socially. The stuff after that, I think that once people establish trust and they understand that you're not an agent of the deep state, or, I don't know, part of a pedophile cabal or whatever we call it, I think you can begin talking with one another. And I keep saying this: once you move past like the two-party narrative and the American exceptionalism narrative, you can start having conversations about power manipulation and like what is actually happening in the country. And once you start having that conversation, a lot of people drop their guard. And all of a sudden, you can start having conversations about what's actually going on. And it's not going to be that trench warfare, Republican versus Democrat bullshit. Victor, that's interesting. Tom Cotton is the GOP nominee. I could see Cotton putting together a little bit of a movement and gathering a little bit of momentum. The problem is that Cotton doesn't have the charisma. They're going to look for somebody who can stand on a stage and who can pound the podium and really get those Mussolini moments in there. That's what I think too. I think Tucker Carlson at some point or another could very well sort of spring into a pole position to be that entertainer in chief, the way that Trump is. I think Howley has a lot of potential to take over. We are going to see, though. Oh, poor Don Jr. Poor Don. What a sad little boy. What a sad little guy he is. He wants you to think that he's so tough. Don Jr. so sad. I gotta be careful here. There are stories among the media and among people who know politics. This is the kind of stuff back in the olden days when you'd go to events and then you'd all hang out at the hotel bar and have drinks and bullshit with each other. There are stories that are well known about Donald Trump Jr. among political media and journalists that are so sad and so heartbreaking. And he's such a sad little boy. Oh, he's such a sad little boy, and he's turned into such a toxic, poisonous human being. I think it really, really shows what a life like that can make a person. And I think Donald Trump Jr. or Donald Trump Sr. is like that as well. I mean, talking to Mary Trump on the Muck Rake about that, like it's talking about like the abusive cycle that goes on there. It's terrible, 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 terrible shit. Terrible shit. Yeah, but I could see Holly like having a moment. I could see Carlson having a moment. I mean, at this point, if you told me Trump ran again in 2024, I wouldn't be shocked. But if he doesn't run, I think he's going to be a kingmaker. And I think in a lot of ways you're seeing people who are jockeying right now for Trump to choose them as the heir apparent, and that's one of the reasons that It's going to be a weird couple of years. Existential haiku. Want to know your thoughts on The Fourth Turning? Has anybody read The Fourth Turning, by the way? The Fourth Turning is a book that came out, I want to say it came out in the early 90s. I could be wrong on that. Somebody fact check me on that. One of my best friends gave me a copy of The Fourth Turning right at the beginning of the pandemic. And he was like, you have to read this. And I read it and I was like, I don't know. So the Fourth Turning is this idea that there are these interactions between generations, and basically they go among 4 generations, and their interactions are constantly repeating each other. And what's funny about that is in the research that I'm doing right now, I actually just got done dealing with Machiavelli, who I assume you've heard. And Machiavelli was obsessed with something called kaiklos. And kaiklos was a leftover from Plato. And Plato had this belief that, like, and so did the 97. Thank you. Plato had a belief that all governments or all kingdoms or systems of government went through cycles, and they would eventually start out in this moment of glory, and then they would deteriorate. Machiavelli and the humanist of the Renaissance. And by the way, the shit that I'm finding about the foundations of modern science is incredible. It's blowing my mind. But what Machiavelli believed was that if we could study the cycles of history, then somebody could understand the cycles of history and take the deterioration and move it back to the past, to a moment of glory. If that sounds familiar, it should, because that's fascism. The idea of fascism is that strong men, right, men of history, could pause history and rewind history. Machiavelli was pushing proto-fascism. Now, spring forward to where we are now, and I saw someone mention this. This is Bannon shit. This is neo-fascism, is the idea that we have these cycles, and if you're just strong enough, and if you can push this mythology or these old symbols or these old ideas or traditions, whether they're real or not, if you can get enough people to believe in those traditions and mythologies, you can reverse history and you can maintain power and control. That's proto-fascism, fascism, neo-fascism. The Fourth Turning, it felt like to me, was a reimagining of the modern era of Plato and Machiavelli's ideas of kaiklos. The question, and by the way, if I just saw that somebody watched the Errol Morris, Steve Bannon documentary, it's good. I would also recommend reading The War for Eternity. I want to say it's by Turtle Bomb, maybe? I forget who wrote that book. It's very, very good. The War for Eternity, which is all about Steve Bannon, Alexander Dugin, and neo-fascistic movements that are consolidating. War for Eternity, very good. But my whole point is it felt like the Fourth Turning was a re-envisioning of the kaiklos idea that Plato and Machiavelli were pushing in terms of controlling society through proto-fascistic ideas, except for there was no diagnosis or prognostication that people should return to past cycles and or control history, if that makes sense. And I thought that they made some generalizations about generations, which is always a little bit dangerous. And also their ability to talk about like high times and low times and what those things constituted. I mean, if you talk to a person of color about the 1950s, post World War II, I don't think that they thought very highly about those high times. You always have to be careful about consensus history and consensus politics, because most of it is on the back of people who are being oppressed. By the way, if you haven't already, we were speaking of bullshit consensus history and politics. Muckrake just released the first episode of our first audio documentary series, Certain Route to Failure. I'm very proud of that thing. Quality Content Steve. We just watched the trial of the Chicago 7 last night and wondered if you'd seen it, if you feel there are useful parallels to be drawn between current state and civil dissent. I've not seen it. I enjoy what Aaron Sorkin does while realizing that Sorkin's idea of politics is completely ridiculous. It's not how politics work. His is sort of this idealized um, idea of how liberal politics should work, which is just by owning the right ideas, saying the right things, giving the right speeches, and appealing to the conscience of our enemies, we will win and they will vote with us. It's not how power works. That's not how politics works. It's a naive, idealistic idea, and it's not how it goes. Um, I haven't seen the Chicago 7, but I will say this. We can have a counterculture and a people's movement in this country. We've seen it. The thing is, in the 1960s and 1970s, you of course have the civil rights movement, and with that you have, it's a parallel when it's a parallel between like Black Lives Matter and the civil rights movement. I mean, that's an equal parallel. But also one of the reasons that the movements of the 60s and 70s gained purchase was because you had a bunch of like middle class, educated white kids who got involved because of the draft and because they were worried about themselves having to go to war. Part of the identity of the counterculture and those movements was that they then joined with the civil rights people and the civil liberties people, and they started to form a coalition of a counterculture. Eventually, when the draft went away, they kind of waved goodbye. They were happy with themselves. They were going to go buy the clothes and the blue jeans, and they were going to carry themselves as hippies or counterculture members, but they weren't going to go to Kent State and get shot. It was a situation where you had a counterculture or a people's movement, and a lot of the people got bought off by power and wealth and ambition. We have to be careful about that. We have to understand that the 1960s and the 1970s, they failed to a certain extent. And this entire idea that they won and that society was changed forever, that's Forrest Gump history. It's something that generation has told us as a story to make themselves protagonists and to hide the fact that a lot of them sold out their principles in order to make money and build empires for themselves. It's a lot. It's a really weird, hard thing to reckon with, the fact that we had that movement at the time, but it also deserted people. But we have to understand that. Because if we're actually going to build a counterculture, if we're going to build a people's movement, if we're going to build a leftist movement, if we're going to change things in this country, we have to understand actual history, not this sepia-toned American exceptionalism Forrest Gump history. We have to have actual history. We have to understand what worked and what didn't work and how we can make that happen, but to make it better. I think that we have real potential in this country. Somebody asked earlier what I'm feeling optimistic about, and I keep saying this. People care more now. They're more tuned in. They're more plugged in. They're coming together. They're forming communities. They're thinking about these things. They're starting to understand the sham of politics as we know it. They're starting to understand the sham of the economy as we know it. It's not fair, it's cruel, it's inhuman, and it's rigged. We know that at this point. If you spend even a couple of moments paying attention, if you scrutinize it even a little bit, we know it. We know it. I have a lot of hope. I really, really do. I really, really do. Cheers. Cheers to that. Cheers to the hope. Cheers to making a better future. Cheers to waking up. Cheers. Man, I missed you all last week. This was fun. I'm glad we got to do this. Glad we got to talk. Frustrating things that pissed me off. I'm sure it pissed you off, but I'm really glad that we got to do this. Y'all are wonderful. Y'all are really, really good people. You give me hope. This week, we got a couple episodes of the Muckrake coming up. I actually thought, if you haven't heard it yet, the Weekender edition that came out on Friday, I thought Nick and I had one of our better episodes. We were talking about the documentary Room 237, and we were talking about conspiracy theories and how we project ourselves and what we care about Heckatron, I answered your question. Heckatron, if you missed it, go back. I answered your question. It was a good question. I like the name, all the good stuff. Heckatron, I'm glad you made it. Yeah, the Weekender edition of the Muckrake podcast, I actually thought was one of me and Nick's best episodes. If you haven't already, you can get a free episode. You can get an episode of the Muckrake podcast by becoming a patron. You also get to get on our Discord. But I thought the Weekender, which I actually have started to really, really enjoy, because Nick and I get on there and he didn't tell his Trebek story. Nick has a story about every celebrity that ever gets brought up. He lives in Los Angeles, and he also knows everybody, so he has stories, but he didn't get to tell the Trebek story. I'm going to make him tell it on this edition of The Weekender on Friday. But I think The Weekender is a great change of pace. I'm really, really enjoying that we get to have these sort of stripped down, more casual, friendly conversations. And I think we got to some really cool stuff with the conversation on Friday. The Substack thing, I just want to say again, thank you for encouraging me to do it. I hadn't even considered doing a Substack. And somebody mentioned it on here, and I was like, maybe. And then everyone's like, no, you should do it. And then I looked into it. And like I said, like, they reached out to me immediately after I signed up, and like, they have just been kind and wonderful. And I feel like I can write about what I want to write about and how I want to write about. It feels so freeing. It was obviously the right move, and I'm glad that I did it. And I was really, really happy that I got to do it. So thank you all for doing it. I did it on your suggestion. I really appreciate the suggestion, the support. If you haven't already, go ahead and head over there and look at what I'm doing. Y'all are great. Y'all are wonderful. Frustrating things, for sure, but I have hope, and you should have hope too. Going to take next week off and then come back the week after. Oh, the Substack is, I think it's like $7 a month, and then I want to say it's like $70 for a year. You get that discount. It's a subscription, is what it means. I don't know what stack is. That's a great question. But I'm going to take next week off of Bourbon Talk, unless the world blows up and there's something that we have to talk about. Or maybe I'll just do like a bonus video or something along those lines. And then we'll be back the next week. Y'all are wonderful. Thank you so much. This was enjoyable as always. Be safe. Be good.